The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
Let me tell you a little story about some friends I know, and a woman who brought the rest of town a gift from long ago. Folks who used to sing for fun, alone or in harmony, had fallen out of the habit, and now we're watching TV. When Alice came into the town, it was a quiet kind of day. Folks went about their business in the usual sort of way. Who'd like to sing in a chorus was her question to everyone. Sopranos, altos, tenors, and bass, together we'll have some fun. We can still sing along, whether our voices are weak or they're strong. The spirit of Alice lives on in song, and we will still sing along. Old and young joined Alice. They formed a community choir. They'd rehearse each week and try to reach those notes going higher and higher. After working all day, they'd practice. There was so much fun in the singing. Even when they'd reach the end and Alice said, "Once more from the beginning," we can still sing along. Whether our voices are weak or they're strong, the spirit of Alice lives on in song, and we will still sing along. Well, the music got better and better, and when they did a show, they'd all pitch in to make it work, and together they would grow. The town was proud of its chorus and moved by the spirit of song. But the day that Alice passed away, it was hard to sing along. Now folks go about their business in the usual sort of way. But once in a while a tune makes them smile, and they still hear a voice say, "Who'd like to sing in a chorus?" was her question to everyone. Sopranos, altos, tenors, and bass, together we'll have some fun. Who'd like to sing in a chorus? That's a question to you from me. Sopranos, altos, tenors, and bass, together in harmony, we can still sing along. Whether our voices are weak or they're strong, the spirit of Alice lives on in song, and we will still sing along. Yes, we will still sing along.
I'd like to share a folk tale. It's called The Edge of the World. And I like this folk tale because I think it's got a little bit of humor, and I think it does, as I said before, talk to the human condition. So this is The Edge of the World. There was a young man who seemed to have everything he needed in his life. He had a nice house, a nice job, lived in a good place, but he was strange in some ways, in that if he got an idea in his head he couldn't figure out or couldn't solve, it just drove him wild and he couldn't think of anything else. Well, one day he got on the idea of luck and good luck, and people talking about my lucky day or my lucky penny or anything pertaining to if I have enough luck, I'll win the lottery or something like that. And he couldn't figure out what good luck meant, and he thought, I've never had good luck. I don't know what people are talking about. So he went to the wise woman in the village and asked her, and she said, I can't answer that question for you. Nobody could answer that unless you go to maybe the king of the gods. Well, where's he? He's at the edge of the world. Well, how do I get to him? You just get out there and start walking, and eventually you'll get to him. So he did. And he walked a day, a week, and a month, and then he came along to a group of wolves playing by the side of the road. And those wolves looked so happy and healthy, and they were howling, practicing their howling and rolling around in the dirt. But there was one little tiny wolf, scrawny little guy, about half the size of the others. His hair was all matted down. He just looked awful. He was sitting on the edge watching, and he said, hey, mister, where are you going? And he said, well, I'm going to find the king of the gods at the edge of the world to answer some questions for me. He said, would you ask him a question for me? Would you ask him why I look the way I do? Look at my brothers and sisters over there. What's wrong with me? Would you find out? And he said, sure, I'll try. And he took off, and he went a day, a week, and a month, and he came to a grove of trees. Pine trees, beautiful, strong trunks and branches, and the pine needles on them were gleaming, except just like the last experience, one scrawny little tree with branches that went every which way, and the needles were kind of brown and falling off at the least little breeze. And that little tree said to him, hey, mister, can you help me? And he said, well, what do you want? He said, I want to find out why I look the way I do, why I can't grow like the other trees. And he said, well, I'm going to see the king of the gods. Maybe I can find out. And he took off. Walked that same day, week, and month again. And then he turned, there was a curve in the road, and he came upon this beautiful cottage, gleaming white, with green shutters and planters under the windows, full of bright red geraniums. And in front of the cottage was a picket fence and all kinds of wonderful flowers. And then the door opened, and out stepped the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen. And she said, oh, I'm so happy to see someone. Come on in and have lunch. So he did. And they chatted and got along. And in the process of the conversation, he told her where he was going. And she said, oh, would you ask him a question? Ask him why I'm so lonely and what I could do about it. So he said, oh, sure. And then he went along, left her cottage, and he walked that day, the week, and a month, and all of a sudden he looked down, and there were his toes right at the edge of the world. And he looked around, and he looked up, and he saw just sky, beautiful blue sky, and clouds, and sunshine, and it was an overwhelming sight. He just stood there. And all of a sudden, up from somewhere came this big cloud, and there was the king of the world, strong and tall and wearing a white velvet robe and a crown and gold decorations all over that robe. And he said, what are you doing here? And the young man said, well, I have a question for you. What's your question? I want to know why can't I have any good luck? Why haven't I never had good luck? Well, the king of the gods looked at him and said, that's because you're stupid, that's why. You don't know good luck when you see it. Now get out of here and don't bother me anymore. You just get out of here and you look around. You'll find out what good luck is all by yourself. So the young man didn't know quite what to do. He said, oh, I also have some questions. I know you got questions. I know everything. And he told him the answers to the questions that he had been asked along the way. And he said, now, get out of here and go find out what luck is. So the young man left. He could not figure out what the king of the gods had been talking about, but he started walking day, the week, and the month, and then he came to that cottage again. And this time that beautiful girl was out in the garden, and she jumped up when she saw him coming, and she said, oh, you're back. I've been so glad to see you. Come on in, let's have lunch again. And they did, and they got along even better. And she finally said, will you tell me, what did you learn about what I should do about being lonely? And he said, well, I got the answer. The king of the gods said, if you got married, you wouldn't be lonely anymore, so you should find yourself a husband. I should get married. Yes. Well, she said, would you like to marry me? He said, I can't. I've got to go find out something about good luck. But if I see some nice young man along the way, I'll send him back to see if he's interested in you. And he left. And he walked till he came to that strand of trees again. And that little tree was out there saying, hey, mister, what'd you find out? He said, well, your story is so interesting because it turns out that years ago, some robbers were trying to escape from the sheriff who was chasing them. They had bags of stolen gold, and they didn't know what to do with them, so they dug out around your roots when you were just a little seedling, and they buried that gold, and therefore your roots have never been able to grow. Now, if you just dig out those bags of gold, then you will start growing, and you should get to be as tall as most of those other trees. Well, said the little tree, mister, would you get a shovel and dig out that gold, because you can have it all. What good is gold for me? I'll give it all to you if you'll just dig it out of there so I can grow. Well, I'd love to help you, he said, but I got to go find out what good luck is. But if I see somebody who looks strong, I'll tell him to come back and shovel out those coins. And he left. And he walked that day, that week, that month. And he got back to the wolves. And that little scrawny wolf was standing there waiting patiently. And he said, what did you find out, mister? And he said, well, you got a strange answer from the man, from the king of the gods. Yeah, what did he say? Well, he said, your problem is you don't eat right. If you ate right, you would grow and be strong and healthy. And his advice to you was to go ahead and eat the first healthy, dumb animal that comes along. Are you sure that's what he said? It's exactly what he said. The first healthy, dumb animal that comes along, you should eat him. Okay. And he did. And that's the story of the man who didn't understand good luck.
The war had ended in Germany. World War II, the same war that Betty was talking about. Ilse was a teenager in a little village there. And Ilse and everyone else in her village were terrified. They knew one of the victorious armies was going to be coming into their village to take over. They had heard horrible stories about each of those armies. They didn't know even which one to hope for to come. Ilse's grandmother was the de facto leader of this tiny village. And she told everyone, when we know the enemy is coming, you come to my home. We will face the enemy together. Eventually, that day happened. Someone saw a long caravan of trucks coming towards the village. The word spread. Everyone gathered in Ilse's grandmother's home. She lit a candle and led them all down to her cellar, where they waited. They heard the trucks pull up in front of her home. They heard doors open. They heard banging on her door, her front door open. They heard the boots on the floor above them. Ilse's grandmother blew out the candle. And they heard and they listened, and finally she said, I am not going to wait here in the dark to be killed. So she relit her candle and started walking up the stairs, singing her favorite hymn. Ein fester Berg ist unser Gott. And to her utter amazement, she was joined by a voice from above. a bulwark never failing. Ilse said later, as soon as we heard that voice singing our hymn with my grandmother, we knew we were safe. No one would sing a hymn with us and then harm us later. We all rushed up the stairs after her and found American soldiers. What I remember most about them were their songs, their smiles, and their chocolate. Ilse's story.
I wrote this song because I don't know how to knit. Now, I know you do.
Yes.
You knit. And I learned a lot of things from my mother, from ironing and cooking to, well, I certainly didn't learn them from my dad, the household chores, but I never learned how to knit. So when the woman who made me this sweater in 1970, who later became my wife, I wanted to give her a gift in return. And it was quite a few years later that I wrote the song. And ever since I've been singing it, people have been telling me stories about handmade gifts that have been given to them. And we all know how much they mean because of that extra ingredient that goes into something handmade or homemade. And one of the stories, I sang this for some friends in Fredonia, and the first time they heard it, my friend Dick Gilman said, I had a sweater. I went to Dartmouth, and I had my Dartmouth green sweater, and it was my favorite. I wore it all the time, and eventually, he was a geologist. He would wear it in the woods, and it got caught on this branch and caught on that branch, holes, and so he'd tuck the loose threads in, and eventually it got so bad that his wife said, you know, please don't wear that in public anymore. Let's keep it for camping. And, well, years later, he said this was really tough for a New Hampshire boy who holds on to things very tightly. He took it out to the garbage and tossed it in the garbage can and said goodbye to it. Well, unbeknownst to him, his daughter saw him do this, who was 13 or 14 at the time. She retrieved it. She mended the holes. She put leather patches on the elbows, and that was his Father's Day gift the following spring. So many stories like that, but here's the story of my sweater. Somebody made this old sweater from 6 or 7 big green balls of yarn. Look how it surrounds me and how it wraps around me, just like being hugged by loving arms. I don't know the name of the farmer. I don't suppose that I ever will. No, I never met him, but I can't forget him. He's the one who raised the sheep and sheared the wool. You know I love my old green sweater. I've worn it for years and it feels good as new. There's just one thing that warms me better, that's your love, that's you. Somebody made this old sweater. You can tell that it wasn't by machine, 'cause every stitch of every row was knitted nice and slow from some wool that was dyed so dark and green. Who took time to clean the fleece and then to card it? I don't suppose that I'll ever know. And who did all the spinning? That was only the beginning, before love was knitted into every row. You know I love my old green sweater. I've worn it for years and it feels good as new. There's just one thing that warms me better, that's your love, that's you. Some folks have drawers just jammed with sweaters, while other folks have none to keep them warm. Well, I have one that's got your touch, and that's why it means so much. And I'll wear it when it's mended or it's torn. Somebody made this old sweater from 6 or 7 big green balls of yarn. Look how it surrounds me, and how it wraps around me, just like being hugged by loving arms. You know I love my old green sweater. I've worn it for years and it feels good as new. There's just one thing that warms me better, that's your love, that's you. That's the love that made the sweater, that's you.
This story is sort of a personal story, but I didn't do it intending it to be that way. Whenever the first Iraqi war started, I read an article about problems, how difficult it was for the families of the soldiers to survive. They missed the people. There were perhaps financial problems. There was a lot of extra responsibility for the wife or the husband left behind taking care of children and so on and so forth. And I thought, no, people don't recognize that. They don't remember that. And I just wanted to tell a story that had something to do with that. So then I thought of this incident and turned it into a story. So I call this story The Letters. When you walked into the small living room and then past that into the dining area, on the back wall, it was all taken up with a map of the world as it was in 1944. And on that map, there were a series of thumbtacks. Started up in upstate New York, went down the East Coast to New York City and Norfolk and Charleston, South Carolina, and then over to Chicago, and then down in Seattle and San Francisco on the West Coast, and one thumbtack way out in Hawaii. Now, those thumbtacks were tracing Pat's places as he served in the Navy in 1944. Pat had been drafted the year before at the age of 35, which at that time was considered quite ancient to be drafted. But the war had been on for a long time, and everybody who could was going. And everyone who was drafted would have been probably overlooked if it had ended earlier. But Pat was married to Mary, and they had 4 children. And Mary was living in that house with the map with the 4 little kids. And every day they would look at that map and trace the thumbtacks and talk about all the places that Daddy had been on his little ship in the Navy as part of the U.S. Naval Fleet. They knew that he was out in the Pacific at this point, but never knew quite where. This was a very tough time for Mary. There weren't any automatic washing machines or interesting kinds of appliances to make life easier then. She also had almost no money, trying to live on whatever the allotment was the Navy sent her. She had a huge garden to take care of and all sorts of hard work to do. But she was only about 32, and she was tough, and she was convinced she could do this. Having also 4 children from age 7 down was not easy at that time. The thing that kept Mary going, however, were Pat's letters. Now, Pat was a great big kind of gruff guy, but he could write a letter that just made you feel good. But this was not email like we're used to today. This was V-mail. They wrote the letters, the letters came on sort of tissuey paper. It was just one sheet, but it folded over and made its own envelope. And you only really had the space of 1 page to write. And then sometimes that was all blacked out. If the censors read it and thought there was anything there that would give damaging information to the enemy, they blacked it out. So you might get a letter that just said, "Dear Mary," and "How are you?" And down at the bottom, as long as it had this, she didn't care if it was blacked out. "I miss you. Give the kids a hug for me. I love you, Pat." If that was there, she got through that day and waited the next day. Now, every day, she tried not to be too obvious about this, but it seemed like around the time the mailman was going to come, Mary made sure she was in the front room or near the front door so she could peek up the street to see if Joe the mailman was on his way, because she was needing those letters to keep going. And if Joe didn't have a letter, she'd be out on the porch saying, "Joe, are you sure you don't have a letter for me down in that big bag of yours?" He'd say, "No, Mary. Pat's out there saving the world for us. We can't expect him to have time to write every single day. You'll get more letters tomorrow, I bet you, or the next day. Sometimes these letters get held up, you know." So she'd go in and she'd reread some of the old letters and get through another couple of tough days. And then all of a sudden, there was a time when there were 4 days with no letters. And by the 5th day, she was not just looking out the window, she was out sweeping off that front porch 6 or 7 times, waiting for Joe to come around the corner. Sometimes, in the past, when he was coming around the corner, if he saw her out and had a letter for her, he'd reach in his bag and wave the letter as he walked down the street, but that wasn't happening now. So a week went by, and 2 weeks. 3 weeks. Joe didn't even want to walk down that street. It hurt him to see how sad she looked. 4 weeks. 5 weeks and no letter. Even those little kids knew something was wrong. And they were kind of quiet, as kids can sense when they better be quiet because their mother had other things on her mind. So by almost the 6th week, Mary was exhausted. And this one night, after days and weeks of going through with what if this and what if that, and what if this has happened, and I wonder if he's hurt, and I wonder if he's in one of those prison camps, and I wonder if his ship got hit, and if he's hurt, and so on, she finally figured out that she had to get some rest. So once the children got to sleep, she went to bed and somehow put all those what-ifs out of her head, and she fell into a sound sleep. And then all of a sudden there was a pounding on the door. She could hear it downstairs, and she jumped up and put her robe on, and she went into the children's rooms to see if they were sleeping, and they were. So she went to the top of the stairs, and the pounding stopped. Oh, I must have been dreaming. I must have been having a nightmare or something. And she started back to the room, and it started up again, pounding and knocking and pounding. And she started down the stairs, and it stopped for a second, and she stopped, and then it started again, and she continued that long walk down the stairs. By the time she got to the last step, she thought she could hear a voice out there calling to her, saying something, but she couldn't tell what it was, and she finally reached for the doorknob and pulled open the door, and there was Joe, the mailman. And he said, Mary, we just got a bunch of letters from way back. They were held up from the invasion of the Philippines. Here's 6 letters from Pat, and I think there'll probably be more tomorrow. And she said, thank you, Joe. And she took those letters, and she couldn't move any further than the steps. And she sat there, and for the rest of the night, she read and reread those letters. Well, Pat got home safe and sound. His ship had been part of the U.S. Naval Fleet at the invasion of the Philippines. That was the time when MacArthur returned, if you remember your history. And he came home safe and sound after the war ended. He didn't talk a lot about his war experiences, but every once in a while he would say something that related to that particular time period. And Mary, who usually didn't butt in, when he got to that part, she would always stop him and say, "Pat, there were a lot of heroes where you were, but right here, my hero was Joe the mailman." And I know that story well because I was one of those little kids up in the bedroom sleeping when all this happened, and I heard about it over and over again. And that's the letter story.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning